When I discuss conservation biology with students, their first thought is often to environmental groups, extremist movements, and some of them think about large biology conservation efforts such as the World Wildlife Fund or something like that that they've seen on TV. But for us, what we want to think more about is how the biodiversity really influences conservation efforts and what it means for changes in communities of organisms and why biodiversity and conservation might be so important. Conservation biology is very goal-oriented, and by that I mean it's really focusing on biodiversity. So what's biodiversity? Do you remember? It's looking at either the genetic differentiation of a particular species, looking at the number of different populations in a community, looking at the influence of changes in ecosystems that may alter the distribution of those organisms across that ecosystem. So maybe a highway is put in and divides an ecosystem. What does that do to those populations? All of these things influence biodiversity. So we can look at a single species. We can look at a single ecosystem, right? But it can also focus not so much on the ecosystem, which would be abiotic and biotic, but instead on the habitat itself. And so most conservation efforts that we see are actually focused on preserving habitats and ecosystems. When we look at the biodiversity, as we mentioned, we can look at that genetic level, the species level, or the ecosystem diversity itself. So there's a lot to take into consideration. What we're going to focus primarily on is ecosystem diversity and think about how that influences a change in biodiversity and how that will then influence conservation efforts. So it's estimated that on our planet, we have anywhere from 1.8 to 200 million different species. Now that's quite a range, right? We don't have a good handle on the number of different beetles in the Amazon. We don't have a good handle on the number of bacteria at the bottom of the ocean. So this is essentially an extrapolation trying to put us into the ballpark of what we're looking at as far as number of species on this planet. So if we don't know our starting point, it's hard to understand what we're losing, right? So if we say that in a given year we lose 10% of our species on this planet, is that 10% 180,000 or is that 10% 20 million? You see what I mean? So we have to think about that as we go through this and kind of keep it in mind, because we put a lot of estimates that our species loss may be approximately 1,000 times larger than it has been in the past 100,000 years. But do we really know that if we don't know a starting point? So these are all estimates. Keep that in mind. But we do know that we are losing things. We know that we're losing a lot of biodiversity in ecosystems. We're losing some things here like the rosy periwinkle. And the problem with losing these kinds of organisms, and you may think, well, it's a plant with flowers that's pretty, but who cares? We actually think that this is an extremely high potential source of anti-cancer drugs. And they've already extracted some from these plants, but if we look at a loss in biodiversity that would include the loss of plants like this, we may not have those sorts of opportunities available to us in biomedical research. That's just one example, right? We can talk about endangered species. Okay, so something like the Amur leopard here that I have for you. When we look at endangered species, this is one that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Okay, so it's literally looking at a decrease in the ecosystem or a change in the ecosystem over either the entire geographical area that this leopard lives or at least in parts. Okay. What about threatened? Threatened are organisms that are likely to become endangered. When we look at endangered species, you can think about them as being lost within your lifetime. Okay? Threatened species may be within your lifetime, but may also be after that. Or if we have turnaround and conservation efforts, we may be able to avoid loss of those species. Now, these are all defined by the Endangered Species Act through the World Wildlife Fund. And so when we look at these changes in definitions, it's pretty much set now. They are looking at many different levels of threatened and critically endangered versus endangered. It's semantics to a point, but we have to keep in mind that it all means bad things in the end. When we talk about most conservation efforts, I think we always go to those big charismatic macrofauna, the large elephants, the large leopards, animals on land. But what you have to keep in mind is we're also losing a huge amount of aquatic diversity, particularly in the oceans. And so we look at about 93% of coral reefs being damaged by humans in recent years. Okay. And if we look at 40 to 50% of the reefs as being home to 1/3 of marine fish species, we're looking at the loss of all, potentially, in the next 30 to 40 years. Nemo, gone. Dora, gone. You remember Finding Nemo? So what is going on that these things are changing? Well, typically what we look at is changes, of course, focused on things that we've done. We do a lot of silly things, right? We can look at urban development, forestry. We need wood for all kinds of things, right? Mining operations for any number of things from coal to natural gas. And then just general environmental pollution. So we're going to look at a few of these and give you some ideas of where we kind of lie on the spectrum. Here's a picture from Brazil looking at, this is virgin rainforest off to the left and bottom of your slide here. And essentially we're looking at all of this in the kind of square, very uniform area, right, as areas that have been recently clear-cut burned for farming. So while farming and agriculture, of course, is important, how do we modify those practices? How do we mediate those practices so that we don't lose all of the potential diversity in the forested ecosystems? So this loss of biodiversity is huge. Particularly when we start thinking then about invasive species coming in who are going to compete with native species. We're going to look at them preying on native species and potentially being parasites for native species. Native species are species that have been essentially indigenous to an area for as long as we know. Locally, we look at purple loosestrife, which you may have heard of. This is what purple loosestrife looks like. So you may not know its name, but you may see it along the roads. This is an extremely invasive species, particularly for the Northeast and Northwest, and huge problems with purple loosestrife outcompeting all of the other vegetation. The problem with it is most things can't eat it. The bees don't benefit much from it, despite all of its flowers. We've got a lot of issues with changes in habitat, runoff, and so on because of the root systems of this changing from the native species and native plants that were in those areas. We also look at changes in use of particular species that would threaten biodiversity. So when we look at fishing and aquaculture, sturgeon that used to be very prominent in the Great Lakes areas have actually become much more rare because of overfishing. We look at loss of bison, of course, in the U.S., used to roam the plains wildly in the U.S., right? And now we see a resurgence of some that are trying to essentially ranch or farm bison, but we still don't see the natural populations we used to. Rare trees, all kinds of things that come into play when we talk about changes in biodiversity. And remember, biodiversity, think about it as percentage of, say, this sturgeon compared to all fish, right, in a given ecosystem.